Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I really want to take this moment just to thank Suzette and Jenny for organizing this, inviting me to take part in the Chats in the Stack series. And I also really want to thank Brenda for that introduction. It really has been a very meaningful relationship and friendship with you for these many years. And I'll actually talk more about that in a little bit. Before that, I wanted to start with a photograph that I've spent a lot of time with over the years. The photograph, Kachin and Michael at Michael's apartment, was originally taken in 1987 by photojournalist Susan Cookland. Over the course of a year, Susan Cookland followed a team of volunteers from the Buddy Program, a pioneering caregiving program organized by Gay Men's Health Crisis, or GMHC, in 1983 to provide care for people living with AIDS. In the photograph, Cookland captures a moment between a volunteer, Kachin, on the left, and in the words of GMHC, her client, Michael, on the right. This photograph is remarkable, I think, not only for the sense of emotional intimacy between Kachin and Michael, but also the physical intimacy. The photograph was taken at a moment when fear of transmission and stigma against people with HIV/AIDS was so high, even as medical knowledge was expanding, so much so that simply being in the same room with someone living with AIDS, touching somebody living with HIV/AIDS would have been very scary for a lot of people. And so again, the physical intimacy here of Kachin literally in bed with Michael is, I think, really moving and important to draw out. I also want to call our attention to one other detail in this photograph, and that's the image on Michael's t-shirt. Michael, of course, is wearing a black t-shirt featuring the image of a pink triangle with the text, "Silence equals death." The "Silence equals death" image was originally created in 1986 by a collective of 6 activist artists in New York. And activists initially pasted "Silence equals death" posters on construction barriers throughout New York City. But within a few months, the "Silence equals death" emblem came to be closely associated with the direct action group ACT UP, founded in 1987. And indeed, the "Silence equals death" emblem was made familiar to many people through photographs and news footage of ACT UP protests like this one, first in New York City and then throughout the world. What does it mean then to see Michael wearing a "Silence equals death" t-shirt at home, not in the street, not protesting, but at home in bed? What I think this photograph challenges us to think about is to rethink the boundaries of social activism as we usually think of them. Home no longer appears marginal to LGBTQ politics and culture, but rather emerges as a central space of social and political change. This is one of the core arguments of my book, The Queerness of Home. The Queerness of Home examines the domestic practices, how domestic practices and ideals shaped LGBTQ relationships and politics in the United States from 1945 to the present, to better understand how LGBTQ people remade and were remade themselves by home spaces. For queer and trans people, I argue, home was the critical site of contact with the conventions of the American family and the gender, sexual, racial, and class norms it brought with it. For Americans in the post-war period after World War II, domesticity was not a purely personal affair, but rather a critical means and measure of citizenship. Performing domesticity correctly, following the gender, sexual, social, and material scripts of white middle-class domesticity, emerged as a central means of demonstrating one's membership in the nation. But LGBTQ people did not simply reject those scripts, but adapted them. They resisted the gender and sexual norms of what I call domestic citizenship. At the same time, they reaffirmed domesticity itself as a primary site and space of belonging, intimate, communal, and national. The book moves chronologically, tracing a range of key modes of queer domestic adaptation and interrogation in 3 sections. Part one looks at some of the ways from the 1940s to 1960s that LGBTQ people sought to fit themselves into the post-war domestic order, with chapters on early practices of lesbian and gay marriage and camp domesticity. Part two moves from the 1960s to the 1970s, tracing two of the ways that LGBTQ people tried to more radically and more publicly remake the home, with chapters on gay male communes and lesbian architecture. Part three moves from the 1970s to the 1980s and 90s to consider how LGBTQ people sought to work more directly with social services and the state, with government agencies, to mobilize home space to address those most marginalized in their communities, with chapters on homeless shelters for LGBTQ youth and adults, and home care for people living with AIDS. From the 1940s to the 1990s, I argue, domestic life grew more and more central in LGBTQ politics and culture as a means of demonstrating and interrogating the place of LGBTQ people in the nation. At the same time, LGBTQ activists worked increasingly to mobilize domestic spaces as sites of inclusive and intersectional politics. This history of queer homemaking, though, has been and remains largely absent in histories of both home and family and LGBTQ life, culture, and politics. Histories of home and family in the United States, for one, have tended to really focus on the heterosexual household, those people who most closely aligned with domestic norms. Scholars of LGBTQ history, meanwhile, have tended to really focus on, again, on public space over private ones, right? And to think about public space as the primary site of community and political formation. And I think that that erasure or elision of home life in LGBTQ history really stems from the larger visibility politics, both of LGBTQ activism, but also LGBTQ history as a field that emerged out of that activism. And you can really think here, if you know that slogan from the 1970s, out of the closets into the streets, right? And everything that's embedded in that, right? Out of the private space into the public space, right? Out of isolation into community. Activists and historians, though, of LGBTQ life, I think, in reframing that, have tended to reiterate what we might call a traditional separate spheres ideology, where the home is presented as a safe, static, and lonely space away from the public life of labor, politics, and community. And that elision, right, that binary is really striking to me because actually feminist scholars over the last 40 years have really worked to deconstruct that idea, to really think about the home as a space of politics, as a space of labor. I'm thinking here about people like Bell Hooks, Dolores Hayden, and Alice Kessler Harris, who've long questioned this idea that home is separate from the public world of politics and labor. And so the Queerness of Home builds on that work to argue for the continued and expanding significance of home after World War II as a mode and measure of belonging and citizenship. What's at stake in this project for me is not only how LGBTQ people fit into the post-war domestic order or didn't, but how Americans more generally have used homemaking as a strategy for interpersonal, cultural, and political connection. And in that, the book really makes two key arguments I just want to draw out here. First, right, is that LGBTQ people have long mobilized home as a space of social and political formation, that home is a space of queer people. But the second point is that home itself, despite its reputation for normativity, is actually a far more contradictory and a far more queer space than historians have generally framed it. The underlying queerness or perversity of home, I argue, is that it operates simultaneously as a site of agency and constraint. The romance of home as a site of self-expression, of intimacy, and autonomy depends on the constraints that it imposes. To uncover this history of the queer home and home's queerness, I've developed a method of research and reading that emphasizes what I call the domestic archive, the objects, images, relationships, and affects that compose everyday home life. And I developed this concept of the domestic archive really to draw our attention to those aspects of home life that are ordinary, repeated, private, ephemeral, and often overlooked. And so that may include things like personal photographs, diaries, letters, as well as home movies. It also might mean reading organizational or social service records for their everyday details. Scholarship on home life after World War II has tended to frame domesticity in terms of ideals rather than practices. I understand domesticity differently, not as a fixed ideology, but as a flexible and ongoing act of social performance. At the same time, uncovering the evidence of everyday domestic life can itself be challenging, especially for those groups like LGBTQ people whose domestic lives weren't legible or often disregarded. Searching for the history of queer and trans domestic life then required new ways of reading and research. One space that was really especially important for me in that process was right here in rare and manuscript collections downstairs. As a graduate student, when I was working on the dissertation that would become the book, I had planned to visit RMC to view materials in the Human Sexuality collection. And I did something that I learned later you should really never, or really try to never do. So I emailed Brenda Marston, the curator of the Human Sexuality collection. That part's good. But I emailed her on a Saturday morning, 5 days before I was due to arrive, to ask if there were any collections she thought I might be interested to take a look at. Miraculously, Brenda actually wrote back an hour later. I checked my records. It was an hour later on a Saturday afternoon. She did warn me to usually not write on a Saturday afternoon. And that really was the start of a really important research process for me. One of the key sources that Brenda pointed me to was the album you see here. These are my research photographs, my original research photographs from the Lee Fuller photograph album. This is just a snapshot from my Google Photos. I think my Google Photos now is about half archival photographs and half photos of my dog. This is just a snapshot of what that looked like. And it really kind of got me started, right, thinking about the kind of, again, thinking about home life. How was it possible with home life to access, again, that, those everyday details, what it was like day to day, not just the ideas, but the practices. With this particular album, which was orphaned, right, from the people who owned it, there was very little information in the album to actually go on. The only thing that I could sort of make out at the beginning was it belonged to these two men whose names appeared in the album, Lee Fuller on the right and Frank Leach on the left, a gay couple who lived in Monrovia, California in the 1950s. The album really provided a powerful glimpse to me of the everyday life of a gay couple in that decade after World War II, most critically, right, their domestic life. And that included things, as you can see here, just from one page of this, right, things like throwing dinner parties, holiday parties with friends and family, but also just posing with their dog, right, at home, right, sort of just, again, those everyday details. And also just, right, to think about the act of constructing the album itself, right, this long photograph album, which was just from the year 1953 to 1954, right, as a domestic act. I made another trip to RMC a few years later, then as a Zwickler Fellow, and then this is another source that I came across that Brenda helped to curate or to preserve. This was a series of photograph albums of a lesbian couple who lived in Philadelphia again in the early 1950s. There were a lot that these photographs couldn't tell me, right? I didn't know, for example, the exact identities of the people in the images, how they met, or how long they were together. All the information that we would typically try to find out about people in the past. I was ultimately actually able to find out more about the Leaf Fuller album. I'll just tease that. It's a longer story if people want to ask about that in the Q&A. But the more immediate impact for me was that actually the absence of so much information, the mystery of these photographs, pushed me to understand the form of the photograph itself as a key part of the story. The desire and the effort to document and preserve these everyday moments spoke to their significance, particularly at a time when the act of getting photographs developed by a gay and lesbian couple would have exposed you to both community and police scrutiny. Archival sources like these also pushed me to take a kind of ethnographic approach to the archive, recovering the larger cultural shift through their traces. Photographs, again, became really central, and there are a lot of photographs in the book, which I really worked to include. They became really central in my thinking precisely because they could get at those everyday moments whose ordinariness made them so easy to miss or forget. At the same time, outside of the archive, interaction with people whose stories I was working to trace also proved deeply meaningful in understanding the stakes of the book. While I was in Ithaca at RMC, I also went to do oral histories with members of Lavender Hill, a gay and lesbian commune that got its start in Staten Island, then moved to the Catskills, before ultimately moving here, where they bought a plot of land you can see here on the left and built a house just south of Ithaca. David Hirsch on the bottom right there, one of the commune founders, welcomed me into his home for an interview. That was actually, David still lives in the home that the commune built. Ned Asta on the top there, who lives just down the road, also drove me actually down to Danby from the Moosewood restaurant and shared boxes of papers and photographs, right? Again, this ephemera from their life together. One of my favorite of those objects is actually this calendar, right? That was like the commune's calendar, right? Keeping track, not just of like the tasks that were, needed to be done, but also the moon, right? The sort of, whether, the full moon. It gives you a good sense of like what, again, of what the texture of life, and also the playfulness of this too, right? The texture of life in that moment. A few years later, I also had the opportunity, as Brenda mentioned, at the Museum of the City of New York, to create an exhibition based on the final chapter of my book, tracing the history of HIV/AIDS at home. Again, activists and artists welcomed me into their homes, into their studios, to talk about the work and the stories that they thought would be most meaningful to include in the exhibition. And those experiences, like the oral histories, those conversations also really profoundly shaped the book. I think really making space for me to feel and think through the emotional stakes of this project. I think that's really helpful, again, for thinking about the meaning of the domestic archive. Right? The domestic archive is not just a material archive, but also, in Anne Kvetkovich's phrase, an archive of feelings, of archive of grief, of loss and trauma, but also intimacy, community, and joy. In the rest of my talk today, I'd like to zoom in a little bit on two of the chapters in the book, right, again, from around that pivot around the 1970s, to consider a little bit more about what queer history can tell us about home's uses and contradictions. I'm going to first turn to lesbian architecture and then to LGBTQ homeless shelters, right, to think about some of the ways that queer and trans people have worked to realize the queerness of home. So we'll start with lesbian architecture. In 1972, 38-year-old architect Phyllis Birkby, seen here on the left, attended an event in New York City on women in architecture. In a letter to her lover at the time, the novelist Bertha Harris, she reflected that the first thing they needed to figure out was, in her words, quote, what we all mean by this absurd term, women in architecture. And they needed to do so away from, quote, them, right? That is, away from men. The experience of that Women in Architecture panel provoked Birkby to make a promise to Harris, quote, I'm going to make a gay architecture, a lesbian architecture, and I'm going to give it to you. For Berkby, the tasks of understanding what it meant to be a woman in architecture and what a lesbian architecture might look like were intimately intertwined and would guide much of her work over the next decade. Both questions pivoted on the nature and constraints of home itself. Since the late 18th century, American understandings of gender, sexuality, and the home and the built environment were tightly bound. Private, domestic space was conventionally understood to define, confine, and protect the feminine body and female sexuality. Yet home was also a principal site of contradiction. It was defined as female space, yet still determined, controlled, and largely designed by men. Berkby argued that reimagining private space was an important step in remaking women's lives and identities. And Berkby's work and life, I think, provides a critical lens into the ways that lesbian feminists of the 1970s sought to expose the gendered power of architecture to renegotiate the public-private divide and imagine a new built environment oriented around what she framed as women's sensibilities and needs. At the core of that project was what Berkby called environmental fantasy. In 1973, Berkby began running a series of workshops in which she asked women to imagine and draw their ideal living spaces, free of any pragmatic constraints. Berkby believed that only through fantasy could women shake off their psychological conditioning and begin to imagine new spaces. And in this and other work, Berkby hoped to empower women to identify and realize what she called a woman-identified architecture and environment, an environment rooted in women's, what she thought of as women's shared aesthetic and emotional values. Berkby discovered architecture at a young age, but also quickly encountered its barriers too. Berkby grew up in an upper middle class household, family in the predominantly white suburb of Nutley, New Jersey. She was the youngest of 3 children. And in her diaries, which are all now archived at the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College, Berkby recalls that frequently she was very sick as a child and would spend a lot of time confined to her bed. And in bed, she would draw detailed plans for cities and towns, quote, down to the food on the table. But in 1950, women represented less than 2% of architects nationwide. That's 400 women total. And by high school, Berkby was encouraged to pursue what was thought of to be a more, quote, womanly career as a painter. And she enrolled at the Women's College of the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, at the time, the largest women's college in the nation. Still, Berkby recalls in her diaries, she did secretly explore her interest in architecture. She and a friend would frequently make furtive trips to the library to read the latest architecture journals. But she said neither of them still thought too seriously about it. It would actually be years before Berkby would seriously take up architecture. She was ultimately thrown out of women's college, essentially for being too open and too brazen about her relationships, her romantic and sexual relationships with other students. And she moved to New York City, where she eventually enrolled in night courses at Cooper Union and started taking a series of small architecture jobs. From there, she went to the Yale School of Architecture, where she was, again, one of very few women, and then took a job at the up-and-coming firm known as, called at that time, Davis, Brody and Associates. But while Berkby was working on a range of projects, she received very little actual public recognition of her work. It was lesbian feminism that radically reshaped Berkby's life. This is a silent clip from a film that Berkby made documenting the second Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day March in New York in commemoration of the Stonewall riots. And with the banner you just saw there was a group of women carrying a banner, "Women's Liberation is a Lesbian Plot." And Berkby would go on to join one of the earliest lesbian feminist consciousness-raising groups in New York, leading her by 1973 to leave her job at Davis, Brody and Associates to start her own practice. And it's at that point that Berkby began running workshops to encourage women to imagine their fantasy environments, those environments they would like to inhabit. As Berkby wrote, quote, "All we had around us was originally fantasized by men, since they were the ones I too acutely felt that dominated the very process that controlled and led to physical form that shaped our very existence. Birkby began by gathering small groups of women to talk and then draw. And she was always, she said, a visual thinker, and she thought that drawing would enable women to tap into hidden or oppressed beliefs and desires that were diminished by male culture. And she specifically sought out women who didn't have any professional training because she thought that women who had attended architecture school had already been conditioned into male standards. Instead, Birkby sought to give women space to explore a utopic future, to make space for unspoken and unspeakable desires, free of the conventional constraints of the, quote, man-made environment. Birkby actually ran her earliest workshops in 1973 among small groups of women that she knew through feminist, art, and literary circles, but nearly all of them identified as lesbians. Over the next 3 years, Birkby took the fantasy workshop on the road to a broader public across the United States, first on her own and later with her partner, scholar Leslie Keynes Weissman. She presented and ran workshops at gay conferences, at architecture conferences, as well as women's centers. And the environmental fantasy project you can see here also became part of one of Birkby's key collaborations, the Women's School of Planning and Architecture, an annual 2-week educational retreat where women in the design professions could meet and learn together. Birkby and Weissman ultimately collected hundreds of drawings, all now archived at Smith College. And nearly all of these really depict women-only spaces, retreats from men, I think suggesting that if not all women of the 1970s were ready to run off and join a commune, they were ready to fantasize about it. Just to give a little bit of a sense of these drawings and some of the ideas that come out of here, one of the big emphasis in a lot of these drawings is flexibility. So this is a great example of them, right, where there's this here's sort of a kind of glass dome like for a home that can be, you can see up here, right, it's kind of opened and closed depending on what people wanted. And all things like demands, like literally, and noise, literally just bounce off the roof. But things like love and the breeze and friends all get in, as well as I'm noticing here, hot fudge sundaes on demand. This is another drawing. This one was titled My Block by Joan, Lavender Lane, in the city of sisterly love. And here kind of actually imagines like taking a conventional city block of kind of individual homes or individual apartment buildings and reimagining them as a kind of group residence and community center, really. And this includes everything like a study space or an art studio. You can see on the right there, there's a health spa and then a recording studio. And then right above that, you'll see that there's a soundproof scream room or a planetarium, right? Again, just to keep your options open. Here's another one that includes at the beginning, right, all of these kind of public rooms and their private retreat, and at the center, a community room for lovemaking. And here's another one, right, that has both down here an introvert room, and at the top, the ultra extrovert space. Just one more here. This one actually had a waiting room for the children. The children were sort of separated off. And I think that what's really striking here, right, is that I think what you're beginning to get the sense of, right, is that the frustration that so many of the women doing these drawings felt was about the isolation of the single family home or apartment that was so common, right, in the 1950s and 60s. And what they were doing, right, in drawings like this was trying to renegotiate the balance between privacy and community. This is actually Birkby's own fantasy drawing. And you'll see here, it's a series of domes, right? So it goes everything from here, there's the monogamy dome, then there's the serial monogamy dome, and also the multiple relationship dome. In a conference, right, at an early gay conference, Birkby presented on this, and she said, when she was creating the drawing, quote, she was just having fun, but it was also serious. Berkeley herself had relatively limited opportunities to realize her own architectural fantasies. Although, again, she started a private practice in 1972, she had relatively few commissions for her own constructions. This is one example, a house that was built by a lesbian couple, Deborah Lobo and Beverly Dash in East Hampton. And what's interesting, actually, that this could have been a really good testing ground for Berkeley's ideas coming out of that fantasy, but the bid for the construction actually came in too high, and so she had to simplify her architecture a fair amount. Still, what you can see here, she was really interested, right, in the ways, and you can see this kind of as an echo from some of those drawings, but again, blurring the line between the natural world and the built environment. Viewed today, I think, Berkeley's commitment to a lesbian feminist architecture can, I think, seem sharply out of line with understandings of gender and sexuality as performative and socially contingent. Berkeley was deeply committed to women's and lesbian culture, and she did frequently rely on essentialist framings of woman as a discrete and natural category, often with little attention to class and race, and no attention at all to trans women. She rooted her work in the evidence of her own experience, decades of oppression in her education and her career, as well as the frequent disappointments and alienation of her romantic and sexual life that only occasionally resembled the lesbian feminist spaces that she imagined. But Berkeley also found in lesbian feminist theory a resource for challenging and expanding the built environment. Her fantasy of lesbian architecture was founded on a more fundamental critique of male power and the script of the heterosexual household. Ultimately, I think Berkeley's work should not be read as a restrictive or exclusive vision of women's territory, but a broader rejection of male-centered and controlled space and the model of domestic citizenship it upheld. At roughly the same time that Berkeley was starting her environmental fantasy project in New York, queer activists on the West Coast were experimenting with another model of queer homemaking, one of the first group homes for LGBTQ homeless youth and adults. Survival House was a drop-in center and group home for queer and trans youth and adults founded in 1973 in San Francisco. The home kind of emerged out of the convergence of two larger grassroots movements. The first was the development of LGBT social service centers as an extension of gay liberation. Survival House founder F.E. Mitchell, known as Mitch, seen here, had first moved to San Francisco in 1970, but quickly saw how many young people who had run away from home or been pushed out of their family homes with nowhere to live and no way to get by. And Mitchell, out of that, was motivated to help, first working at a gay drop-in center and then determining to found Survival House. Just briefly here, Mitchell was also building on a larger kind of discourse and interventions around runaway youth, which was a major concern of the 1960s and 70s. And throughout the late 1960s and early 70s, other group homes for runaway youth began to emerge in cities across the United States, like Huckleberry's for Runaways in San Francisco. But very few of these would have had any focus on LGBTQ young people. For Survival House, the house itself was rarely covered in the news media, but a documentary filmed in 1977 offers remarkable evidence of daily life in Survival House and the range of people who lived there. Bruce Pavlov was a young architecture student at University of California, Berkeley, taking a new course, then a radical idea, a new course on gay spaces. And for the final project, he visited the house on Haight Street over several months, interviewing and photographing and videotaping its residents. And just in these silent clips here, you can already get some of the sense of, right, of how residents interacted, right? Just getting together for dinner, dancing, putting on makeup, doing each other's hair for a night out. Living communally, of course, could be quite challenging. Few of the residents complained about the chaos of the house. Fanny, one of the few cisgender women at the house when Pavlov was there filming, described to Pavlov that Survival House, which actually referred to the idea of survival services, that Survival House was a good name for the space because if you could, quote, survive here, you could survive anywhere because you had to deal with so many things. One of Pavlov's interviews is actually interrupted when 3 residents were worried that a stranger had actually broken into the house. It was actually a new resident. More commonly, though, residents expressed a sense of connection to the house and a feeling of family. A young man seen here on the left, Attila, recalled being referred to the house when he first arrived in San Francisco. Quote, "I didn't have any place to stay. I didn't have any money, and I was very lonely too at the time, and I needed someone to talk to. And I think this is my family now, in a way." A transgender African-American resident named Janice explained, quote, "I like helping people, and here at the house, there's a lot of things that you wouldn't normally experience, you know, at home or living by yourself. You learn about various people's lives. It helps you understand people better." And here's just one clip from another resident named Chesty.
How do you find living here? The fact there's so many people in a room, does it bother you at all? Or?
No, it don't bother me. It's sort of really nice. I like being around a lot of people. It's not like being in home by yourself in your own room. You're out in the open with I have 3 other guys in my room. And they're all just nice and everything, and I just get along with them perfectly. And that's, really about it.
For many of the residents, Survival House was a profound relief, providing a space to construct a new kind of family where they could feel accepted and understood, and together transformed shelter into home. Yet the desire to build a new kind of queer home also rested in tension with the need for residents to leave the house and make room for others. And while Survival House promised family, as a residence, it could only ever be temporary. Residents were expected to learn to live on their own. And in this photograph, you can see just again the range of the services intended, right, to move, right, from kind of supporting people, right, to getting them out on their own. And in doing that, I think also just looking at many of the kind of funding reports, you can see the ways that the creators of Survival House are really struggling to match up with with government donors or government funders, like ideals about productive middle-class citizenship. Right? Survival House is promising a family, but the model isn't set up for a family that can last. What I hope that we can see in these 2 examples is that there's nothing inherently normative about domestic space. Rather, both Berkby's Environmental Fantasy Project and Mitchell's Survival House reveal just 2 of the ways that queer people have sought to redefine home for themselves. There are, of course, challenges along the way. Berkby, in seeking to combat the patriarchal underpinnings of domestic architecture, nevertheless found the field at her time largely closed to women and resistant to intervention. Mitchell, meanwhile, found the terms of productive citizenship came back to haunt him in seeking to gain the support of the state. Right, ultimately, I'll just say that Survival House closed just 5 years after it had opened in 1978. In both cases, the queer potentiality of home is nevertheless haunted by the normative gravity of domestic citizenship, by a normative vision of the kinds of families and citizens the home is imagined to make. I don't take this, though, as a sign of failure, but rather of futurity. Both Berkby's and Mitchell's work call on activists, architects, social workers, and scholars to question the home's normative scripts and see them as potentially revisable. And Berkby and Mitchell's work also suggests that fantasies, even when they aren't fully realized, are still essential to push the possibilities of home and everyday life forward. This tension, I think, between fantasy and pragmatism, between creativity and compromise, has been, I think, I would argue, increasingly central to the broader sweep of LGBTQ activism in the last 50 years, as LGBTQ people have increasingly sought the recognition and support of the state. Home and family have been core to this drive for recognition, with same-sex marriage as the clearest example. But the history of the queer home reveals a much longer and more complex story. queer people have in fact pushed American culture and politics to acknowledge and support more diverse household forms over decades. At the same time, they've had to wrestle with the home's normative scripts too. The question queer people have struggled with is by no means unique to them, but rather more fundamental to the structure of home itself, a question I think that's ongoing both for individuals, for their communities, and for the state. How can people create structures of everyday life that support the worlds that they hope to build, while leaving space for the messiness and innovation those worlds may bring? Thank you so much, everyone.
All right, I will bring the mic to you. Whoever wants to ask a question, raise your hand. And if there's a question on chat, I'll watch for Wendy's hand.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed everything you just said. And I'm wondering, similar to Survival House, were there examples of places like that for like LGBTQ people that wasn't like made out of necessity or escape or refuge from bad situations? Like, do people ever just choose to live communally, or are there examples of people who just like wanted to, I don't know, build a place to live with other people?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you know, one of the things, the way that I organized the book is what I really looked for were sort of moments when, like, to look for where ideas about domestic life kind of converged. And so like in the 1960s and 70s, there are a lot of queer and trans people who are starting to form communes or living collectives, similar to the ways that other activists are doing that as well, but with different kinds of goals. So there are really the first of these are really what were called often lesbian lands, or women's lands, where women like Berkeley, right, were trying to get away from men, right, to sort of get away from men to remake family, right, away from men, and remake gender away from men. And similarly, many gay male activists also do that. And that, I think, tradition of queer collective life has continued. Many of the lesbian lands and kind of gay male communes in the rural areas that emerged in the 1970s still exist and kind of exist now as sanctuaries. And of course, there are also people who just living communally in cities and suburbs and other places. But again, I think what's interesting about the 1970s is that's a moment when anyone who was part of queer culture in the 1970s would have carried this idea that not just that living communally might be joyful, right, but that it was really important for advancing the movement.
Thank you. Your bringing up the domestic archive was really fascinating, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your experience interacting with these domestic archive materials, or how institutions, how they acquire such materials from people in homes.
Thank you for that question. One of the things that took a long time with this project was finding evidence, right? Because one of the things that always strikes me, right, is that when materials are cataloged, right, we often think about things being cataloged around like the name of a person, right, or the name of an organization. But things generally in the catalog, in a library catalog, are not organized or archived around things like domestic life, right? Because again, if your idea is that domestic life is not political, then it's not necessarily going to be the most central thing to label it. And so that's why it was really important to actually have conversations with archivists. Like with Brenda, I had a similar conversation at the One Archives where I would said, like, I'm interested in queer home life, right? And sort of brainstorming together. Archivists, just to say, are amazing, right? Because they know the collections so well in a way that a finding aid really can't capture. The thing that's also just really interesting, right, is of course that a lot of the earlier materials, like the Lee Fuller album, were orphans, right? Were no longer in the possession of the people who owned them, right, or even the people who knew them. I think Brenda and I were looking. Brenda, you look back at this for me, that you bought the Lee Fuller album. I think you said for $150 from a collector who is also an alumni. And there's a lot of people who collect images like these of queer people and trans people in the past. But it took, but you have to, I think, really think about that, right? Also the lesbian couple, right, in Philadelphia, right, that families, right, often wouldn't think, actually in the 1950s and 60s, to preserve the evidence of the lives of gay and lesbian and trans people. Right? I think that's changed right now, and it changes already by the 1970s and 80s. But in 1950s and 60s, right, it wouldn't have been a lot of families' impulse to save that material if there was, again, homophobia, transphobia, and cultural shame around those lives. Right? And so it actually took, I'll say, a long time to find out more about Lee Fuller and Frank Leach. And the thing that really changed it for me was that I knew their names for a long time, but I couldn't find them in any evidence of them in the census record, because the 1950 census, right, only just became publicly available, was just opened. But there have been a lot of newspapers, a lot of local newspapers that have been digitized since I first came across that album about 10 years ago. And so I was able to find actually a lot about Lee Fuller and Frank Leach. One of the things that, among other things that was so striking to me, I didn't know how long they'd stayed together. One of my theories was that, right, maybe this album, maybe like Lee Fuller and Frank Leach broke up and they couldn't stand to look at this album and kind of just threw it away. The reality was that they were together for over 20 years. I found an obituary for Frank Leach from I think around 1974, and it said that he was survived by his friend Lee Fuller and Lee Fuller's mother Haiti. Because the other thing I didn't know until I found more records was they also lived with Lee Fuller's mom for all of that time, which again, not how we think about gay couples of the 50s. Right? And that sort of again opened up the story in different ways. But again, just to your early question, I think what's been so joyful about working on this project, right, is again finding evidence of this and really trying to begin as much as possible, when possible, to find out who these people were and find out more about the lives that they led.
So we have a group who are attending virtually from Hobart and William Smith, and they have a question. They said, do you feel that in today's society, LGBTQ people have found their home? And then relatedly, could you speak about the era of your archive? Does the book's archive end in 1995?
Thank you all for being here virtually with us and for that question. I'm interested really in this question, have LGBTQ people found their home now? And I think, right, and I'll just stay within the United States, right, I think that really depends on where, and I think it really depends, and I think it's really unstable, of course, right, that right, we're at a moment when trans young people are really under attack by different states, right, where where it seemed, right, that there was space being made in curriculums and libraries for stories about LGBTQ people and histories about LGBTQ people, that we're finding, right, that those successes actually are very unstable depending on the state that you live in, like in Florida, of course, or Texas. And so I think that and in many cases, like in Texas, there are stories of people literally forced to leave Texas, right, in order to be able to live their gender, right, and being forced with their families to leave because they can't get trans-affirming care in that state. And so I think it's a very unstable story, and I think that question for me speaks about actually the urgency of the question still, and about the stakes of having a sense of home, right, are really vital and really urgent actually in queer activism and trans activism now. In terms of the era of the book, the focus of the chapters is from around 1945 to 1995, but the epilogue does bring it up a little bit more to the present. Because part of what I'm interested in, right, is the ways that family, again, and home and household formations still are kind of up for question or still needing to be pressed on. There's a lot of people, right, living, I think now that same-sex marriage is recognized, I think there are still questions, right, whether that was the right civil rights battle to wage in the first place. But we also see people pushing on the marital contract as a form of citizenship. But there are some states, some cities that have started to recognize multiple partner households, so people living in polyamorous relationships, will recognize that actually what matters in a household is who you say, is your family, and that the state shouldn't be imposing its idea about that a family, is two married people, but that determination of what a family is should be driven, by the people living in that family. And so again, I bring it up to the present in the epilogue to raise, again, the ways that these are still active questions, about what kinds of family forms does the state recognize, or might they recognize, and who does that leave out? How can the home essentially, how can we recognize, again, the queerness of home in the policies that we live with?
Thank you so much for this talk. I really, really enjoyed it, and I also really enjoyed your book. I'm really glad to get the opportunity to see some of Phyllis Berkby's films, which obviously is not something that we can do in print still, but I was very curious about the wider context of gay architecture and also how you decided to focus on Berkby as kind of a central figure in that.
So it took me a while to find Berkby's archive, but when I found it, there was almost an overwhelming amount. I mean, she was somebody who kept everything, So all of her architectural drawings, all of her diaries, all archived at Sophia Smith, and it took a long time to work those through. And I liked, there would have been other ways to get at that story, but I liked the way that Berkby helped to bring in the story of not just lesbian architecture, but lesbian feminist activism and their engagements with home in the 1970s in a way, that she gave us a way through it as a reader. And and there were just so many connections that came out of that. Berkby actually designed, I talk about this in the book, Berkby also designed, it turned out, from these papers, she redid the bathrooms for Edie Windsor and Theda Spire. Edie Windsor, the plaintiff at the center of the Defense of Marriage Act Supreme Court case, because at some point Theda Spire had lost mobility and needed to install, to make the bathroom more accessible. And I love this idea, of reframing that case around the Defense of Marriage Act and reframing the architecture as principally about care. This case that seemed to be all about marriage was actually a case about care. Because I think that also helped me, and I think this is part of what, again, architecture helps us to do, is complicate our idea about the structures that we live with, whether they're architectural structures or legal structures. Berkby was really, I think, among the most forceful in questioning that, but also giving other people space to do so too. And that really, I thought, was powerful. Thank you.
I have one more question online, and this will be our last question. So Isaiah says, hello, and thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. What role do you see technology playing in creating new imaginaries for LGBTQ home life? What opportunities do you see? Are there threats?
That's a great question, and I think a complicated one, because of course I think, I'll say that one of the things that was striking to me is I finished the book. I finished the final draft of the book and did the copy edits, and proofs during lockdown and COVID. And so I thought a lot about home and technology at that moment, and the ways that home isolates. I think sometimes there are elements of the book and moments when home is a really liberatory space, but finishing the book in lockdown and COVID, was also made me challenge that, It made me think again about the way that home isolates, There's a way that home protects, but also isolates. And I think that binary or that complexity is really important to hold on to. I think technology, or various kinds, is part of that, There are of course, lots of technologies tied to the home, I'm thinking about media technologies that make the home a space of entertainment. We could think about this, of course, analog technologies like record players, if we're back in the 50s and 60s, but also things like streaming movies and television now, where, right, the future of public space and movie theaters, right, is unclear, right, because home has become such a site of entertainment. And so I'm interested, right, in the ways that technology at home, right, is also still a site of connection and culture, right, also social media, of course, too, and the ways people, way Instagram, right, is its own kind of domestic archive when we look back on this, if somebody actually figures out how to preserve it. But I also think it's, again, that the complexity I think we have to approach with technology is the same complexity that we have to come to with home in general, right? That it can be a space of connection, but it can be a space of isolation as well. And I think our challenge, right, is to think about how to navigate, right, both the home's constraints and its possibilities. Thank you all so much for being here.